Today's daf is daf Tzadi Vav, and we'll start on the Mishnah, which is 5 lines down from the top of the Yom. And the subject of the Mishnah now is a comparison between the various categories of pu'ulot, of actions that are necessary for preparing the Chavite Kohen Gadol, which were made up of 12 lechamim that the Kohen Gadol would bring every day, 6 in the morning, 6 in the afternoon. And he starts with an isaron of soles, and then he breaks it up into a chatzi isaron, so that the morning chavitim constitute chatzi isaron, and the afternoon another chatzi isaron. And there are various actions that are done in order to prepare for the chavite kohen gadol. And we discussed this in the Mishnah before. We have what's called lisha, which is kneading, and then we have aricha, which is called shaping, and finally afia, which is baking. Now, these activities are performed after the dough has already been prepared. The flour has already undergone the following processes. Number one, tchina, which is grinding. Number two, harkada, which is sifting. But the Mishnah sets up a distinction between category A and category B. Category A are the critical activities that are really close to creating the lechamim, and they require what's called a bifnim. Bifnim means that these actions have to be done in the azara. Whereas tchina and harkada, which are way, way before, you don't even have flour yet because you need to grind it and sift it. Those actions are performed outside of the azara. And the question is going to be lina. The nafkamina is going to be whether or not you override the Shabbos. So the Mishnah says, Chavite Kohen Gadol, lishosan varichosan avafiyosan bifnim, v'dochos es Shabbos. Anything that's done bifnim would have to be done on Shabbos. The reason for that is because if it's done bifnim before Shabbos on Friday, then it attains its kiddush, its sanctity, and then it'll be pasul belina, because you're going to have to wait till Friday night and Shabbos morning in order to finally get around to eating the lechem, and therefore you have to override the Shabbos so that you postpone the sanctification of the dough and the breads until Shabbos itself. However, the Mishnah says tchinosam v'arkadosam, these two actions of preparing the flour, which precede adding any sort of liquid that would allow for kneading the dough, and those are grinding and sifting, eino doches haShabbos. These can be done on Friday because they don't require bifnim, meaning they don't have to be done in the Kodesh. They're not sanctified, and if they're not sanctified, then there's no psul of lina. And we have a principle, as we'll soon see, in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Let's read it inside. Klal Rabbi Akiva kol malach shefshal asos be'erev Shabbos ein dochas Shabbos, but v'efshal asos erev Shabbos dochas Shabbos. Any activity that could be performed before the Shabbos, you cannot do it on Shabbos, because why violate the Shabbos if you could do it without violating the Shabbos on Erev Shabbos? And that will explain why the tchina and the harkada, the grinding and the sifting, would not override the Shabbos, because they could be performed on Erev Shabbos, because there's no sanctification, and therefore there's no psul of yotze, of lina. However, in the cases of kneading the dough and setting up the shape of the dough and baking the dough, all these are done in the Kodesh, meaning in the Chatzar Mishkan, or what we call the Azara, and therefore they are sanctified. And insofar as the sanctification is generated by Lisha, Aricha, and Afia, which is done inside, then you cannot perform them on Erev Shabbos, because then you'll subject them to a psul of lina, and therefore the only possibility is to perform these final acts of preparation of the minchas chavitim of the Kohen Gadol on Shabbos itself, and therefore you override the Shabbos. And clearly, Lisha is a violation of a malach on Shabbos. Lisha is one of the 39 malachos, Afiyah for sure. Aricha, I'm not sure. I vacillate as to whether Aricha is a Derabanan or a Dorais. Now the Mishnah leaves Minchas Chavitim on the side and picks up the issue of Shar Menachos. And the Mishnah says the following: Kol HaMenachos yesh bahem Mase Kli Bifnim v'ein bahem Mase Kli Bachutz. Meaning, with regard to all other Menachos, everything, all the procedures that are necessary, have to be performed and implemented in a kli shares, in the Azara. And they don't have any earlier procedures that can be done outside the Azara in a kli chol. And therefore, in these cases, we have to understand that everything from the actions that require a kli shares of both Lisha and Aricha. Again, there's no Afia in these cases. We're not baking breads. So in any event, these actions have to be performed in the Kodesh. Now, why is it that in a regular mincha, an ordinary mincha, that needs to be kneaded and shaped, it requires a kli shares, and it's got to be done inside the chatzer? And apparently, our Mishnah holds that the kneading is done not because there was already a kiddush in a measure called a kli, a utensil called an isaron. The isaron itself would not actually be mekadesh because it's used for a solid liquid, and therefore it doesn't have the status of a kli kodesh. But rather, we're up to the state of kneading. So anything before kneading was done in an isaron, which is for solids, and didn't subject itself to being consecrated, meaning kiddush, because we're holding that a kli for solids is not a kli shares. But once we get up to the kneading stage, which is the point in which we already have a liquid element, then that itself might require kiddush. However, we had a Gemara way back when in Maseches Menachos on Daf Nun Tes that seemed to indicate that there's a special pasuk from which we derive the conclusion that the kneading and the shaping of the minchos, the stam minchos, requires a kli shares. Again, it would seem that the simpler way of going, although I don't know how to deal with that Gemara there, would be to go the way Tosa seems to go, that just like in the case of the minchas chavitim, once you add the oil, which is a liquid substance, then the measuring vessel for liquids is definitely, according to everyone, Makadesh. And therefore, every mincha, since you're getting up to the point of kneading, and therefore you added the oil, it's subject to kiddush, and therefore it requires the chatzar mishkan. Shtei lechem. Now the Mishnah goes on to address the questions of both shtei lechem and the lechem aponim, and to delineate the sizes of the lechamim. And the lechamim are somewhat complicated because they had what's called chronos. So in general, we could say the following: Shtei lechem, archon, the length was shiva tvachim. Rachban, their width was arba tfachim. So we're talking about something that is 7 by 4 tfachim. And this is derived from a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Then we have karnosera, and let's say a few words about karnosera, which literally translates as their horns, which means by attaching strips of dough to each of the corners of the loaf, that would create chronos, which were much smaller. They were arba etzbos. They were 4 finger breadths in length. Okay, that's as far as shtei halechem is concerned. The lechem aponim is much, much larger. Oh, I think it's close to double the size. Arkan arba asara tvachim. Instead of 7, it's 10 tvachim. But rachban, instead of 4 tvachim, are chamisha tvachim. The karnosea, instead of 4 tvachim, 4 etzbos, are sheva etzbos. So we're talking about the lechem aponim, as we mentioned yesterday, that the edges, the outside edges of the lechem were folded up. The dimensions here in our Mishnah are the unfolded loaves of lechem aponim. Now, exactly what an etzba is, according to the Rambam, the etzba is the thumb. And in fact, there are 4 etzbos to a tefach and 6 tefachim to an amma. So the horns of the shtei lechem, which we started with, which we said are arba etzbos, right? Karnosel arba etzbos. So that's equal to a tefach. Did I get that right? Just 1 second. Right. So again, getting back to the chronos of the shtei lechem were a tefach in length. However, those of the lechem aponim, which we said that karnosel sheva etzbos, as opposed to arba etzbos, that's 1 3/4 tefachim, because you need 8 etzbos to get a full tefach, and here you have 4 etzbos plus 3 is 1 3/4. And now Rabbi Yehuda wants to give it simonim. Like, we have on Leila Pesach, Rabbi Yehuda would say Tzach Adash V'Achav for this Eser Makas. So he has 2 words that are made up of Rashi Tevis that will tell you what the shtei lechem is made up, the sizes, dimensions, and the lechem aponim. Shalotit, if you can remember the following, I don't know how you remember this, but Zadad and Yahaz. Right? So if you take a look at the word Zadad, So that's going to give you the length, the width, and the size of the horns, the length of the horns of the shtei lechem. And whereas Yahaz is going to give you 10 and 5 and 7, which is going to be the length, width, and the length of the horns. Ben Zoma Omer, v'nasata al hashulchan lechem panim lefonai tamid. Why does the Torah call the lechem panim? Asks Ben Zoma. And the answer is lechem panim, sheyulo panim. Ben Zoma is telling us that the bread has several faces, several surfaces. And this means that they would create certain walls by folding the lechem hapanim upward at each end. And they create certain walls, as we said, and those walls are the faces of the lechem. Hashulchan. Now, today's daf will focus mostly on the shulchan. Arbasre v'rochbo chamisha. Arko asara v'rochbo chamisha. So the length of the shulchan was 10 tefachim, which is very interesting because we said that the length of the lechem hapanim was 10 tefachim. So that means that the lechem hapanim took up the entire length of the shulchan. That's why we're going to have to fold it over, because again there are two marachos of 6 each on both sides. Lechem hapanim, which already we established, arko asara, right? The length was 10 tefachim. V'rochbo chamisha, the width was 5 tefachim. Now, if you have two lechamim on two sides of the shulchan, and the shulchan is only 10 tefachim, and the breads themselves are 10 tefachim, so we have to figure out how to bend over the sides of the lechamim to fit the shulchan. And therefore the Mishnah says, no saying arko keneged rachbo, right? You do it like that. So you have the width of the table, and you don't put the whatchamacallit, the two lechamim on both sides on the width, because that's impossible, but rather you turn it this way, and I guess it's balanced somehow on the table, which is called arko keneged rachbo. But now we're going to do the folding over, and we're going to have two shitos in the Mishnah about how much you fold over. The Mishnah starts with the first shita and says, no saying the kofel tfachayim umechza mikan utfachayim mechza mikan. So on both ends of the lechem, they would fold over the lechem, which is, by the way, matzah, okay, 2.5 tefachim. Right? Whose shita is this? This is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to soon see that Rabbi Meir has 2 tefachim, but Rabbi Yehuda has 2.5 tefachim on each side. So by folding 2.5 tefachim upwards from each side of the 10 tefach loaf, one creates walls that are flush with the sides of 5 tefach, which is great because now you have 5 tefach here and 5 tefach there, because we said that the shulchan was 10 tefachim. Now, yesterday we had a machlokes between Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yochanan about the shape of the lechem. According to Rabbi Chanina, the lechem was shaped like an open box, right? It was a box, but it was open on top. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan holds it was shaped like a ship, like a boat. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the 2.5 tefach folding over begins not at the edges of the table, but at the middle of the loaf. They were not vertical, but curved upwards and outwards in the shape of a ship's hull until they reach the edge of the table. So I have a little bit of a diagram here. And according to Rabbi Yochanan's understanding, the 2.5 tefachim do not represent the size of the fold itself, which is a full 5 tefachim, half the length of the boat of the loaf. Rather, 2.5 tefachim represent the vertical space that the loaf occupies until the table. Anyway, let's go on. This is all divrei Rabbi Yehuda nimtza arko mimale rachbo shel shulchan. Right, the length of the leg of the bread will now fill the width of the table, because the 10 tefachim of length are folded in such a way that they extend to the edges of the table. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the 5 tefachim of width cover half the length of the 10 tefach table. Since there are 2 stacks of bread, right, the 2 marachos, the entire surface of the table is covered with the lechem. Then we get to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir has the opinion that Hashulchan was Arko Shnei Masar. So there was a longer table, according to Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Meir, by 2 tefachim, Rachbo Shisha. And the width was 6 tefachim. Right, the ratio between the length and the width seems always to be 2 to 1. So, for example, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if the length of the table is 10, then the width of the table is 5. According to Rabbi Meir, the length of the table was 12, and therefore the width is 6. Lechem aponim, what was the size of the lechem aponim according to Rabbi Meir? Arko asara v'rachbo chamisha. So what do we have over here? Now the discrepancy, or the what word am I looking for? The extension of the table beyond the lechem would be 2 tefachim in its length. And therefore, again, no sein arko keneged rachbo shel shulchan. In this case, Rabbi Meir is like Rabbi Yehuda. But as far as kofel is concerned, all you need is tefachim mikan and tefachim mikan. You only have to bend it upwards 2 tefachim on each side. And when you subtract the 2 tefachim on each side from the 10 tefachim, then you end up with 6 tefachim. So you can have 6 tefachim on the left side, 6 tefachim on the right side, all told 12 tefachim, which is the size of the length of the shulchan. Utfachayim revach ba'emtza. He leaves 2 tefachim of open space in the middle of the table of the shulchan. Kedei shetei haruach menasheves bam. Right, we need airflow, because otherwise the breads become stale or moldy. Abba Shol Omer, Shama yunostim shnei beziche levona shel lechem aponim. Right, we said now, according to the Mishnah, that there was an open space to allow for the airflow. In that open space, says Abba Shol, they would place the bazichin of the levona. Omru lo. So they turned to Rabbi Shol and they said to him, Varei kvar nemar, the Pasuk says, V'nasata al amareches levono zaka. Right? The Gemara, I should say the Mishnah, understands that the word al should be understood that it's mamish on top. Remember, we had a machlokes what the word al means, whether it means on top or al means besamuch, meaning near it. So this pasuk in Vayikra of Dalid seems to indicate, according to the dissenting view that argues against Abba Shaul, that the levona was placed directly on top of the lechem, not in the airspace between the lechem and the shulchan, or the lechem and the next lechem. Amar lehem, Sir Abba Shaul responds, Harei kvar nemar. I have another pasuk in Bamidbar, in the second chapter, describing the Machne Ephraim, and one of the three shvatim that encamped in the Machne Ephraim was Menachos, and the pasuk says that Menachos was upon Al, the tribe of Ephraim. Now we can't say that Al means physically on top of him, the Ola Matem Menachos, but rather we have to assume that Al means besamach, it means near. And so too with regard to the Levona, with regard to the Bazichin, they were placed near the Lechem, which means in the space, the open space. According to Rabbi Yehuda, however, who holds that the Lechamim fill the tabletop, the Bazichin must be placed upon the top uppermost loaves, right, on both sides, one and one. There's no room for them on the shulchan itself. Okay, now we talk about other parts of the shulchan that would facilitate the holding up of the lechamim. Arba snifim shel zav hayusham. So the snifim are the walls that on the sides of the shulchan, and they were made of zahav. Mifutzolim b'rashehem. So on the top of these snifim, they had pitzulim. He translates pitzulim as projections, but I like a different translation. I prefer pegs. Anyway, the snifim contained these pitzulim, which are pegs, so that the kanim, which we're about to learn about, would be sitting on these pegs. And there were pegs protruding from the sides of the snifim, and shahayu somchim bahem. So the lechamim, just one second, I'm not sure why he doesn't mention the kanim yet. That's going to come later on. Just one second. He says here that the snifim were upright posts that stood on the floor alongside the shulchan, and their width was equal to that of the lechem, meaning 5 tefachim. Okay, so I believe that the pitzulim were there to support the kanim. Let's see if the Mishnah will bear me out on that. Shnayim l'seder zeh. So you had two snifim on one side of the shulchan, u'shnayim l'seder zeh, and two for the other side of the shulchan. V'esrim u'shmonim kanim. Oh, that's what we said before, that how many pitzulim were there of these protrusions, or we call them pegs? There were 28 of them. And those 28 would hold, those pegs would hold up the kanim, the rods, and the lechem was placed on these rods. Now, what did these rods look like? Kechatzi kanechol, half of a hollow reed. And now we need on both marachos of 6 and 6, we need these rods, these kanim. All told, 28. Split them in half. Arbasa l'seder zeh, arbasa l'seder zeh. Now, how do we get this number arbasa? So that's going to be a sugya that we're not going to get to today. That's for tomorrow. Anyway, the snifim, as we saw, had pitzulim. Okay, I don't know. I don't see anything here that would help us understand this better. He says here that the kanim were placed upon the pitzulim, which is very good. That's how I understood it. Tosfos calls the pitzulim notches, into which they inserted the ends of the rods. Each and every rod would rest on a peg. Each pair of snifim, we said there were two pairs of two each, contained 28 pegs, 14 for each one of the snifim. Okay. Then the Mishnah says regarding these kanim, lo sider kanim doches velo netilas doches hashabbos. Right, to set up these kanim, which again, I don't know exactly what malacha would be involved here. Probably a malacha derabanan, because it's nirek boner, and to remove them, which is nirek soser, so the rabbanan asid b'torah shvus, is none of that doches a Shabbos. We won't violate the Shabbos. So don't set up these kanim or remove them on Shabbos. The Kohen goes into the Heichal, where the Shulchan was, on Erev Shabbos, and Vishomto, he removes the rods. V'nosno liarbo liarko shel shulchan. He places them along the length of the shulchan. The Kohen would enter the Mikdash before Shabbos, remove the kanim that were between each loaf, place them on the floor along the length of the shulchan, and on Shabbos he removed the old lechem upon him and arranged the new ones in two columns. After the Shabbos, he would return to insert the rods between the stacked loaves. So I don't understand exactly over Shabbos. It sounds like there were no rods to separate. And I don't know. I don't know exactly how that works, logistically. If you put one lechem directly on top of the other, I don't know. Anyway, kol hakelim shali b'migdash arkon li arko shelbais. When you had a kli, where did you place the kli? And the Mishnah establishes it's got to be east-west. So, for example, we talk about the shulchan. It was placed lengthwise from east to west. Same is true of the menorah, and it should be true of the Aron. However, the Aron, the Gemara is going to try to explain, went from north to south. Anyway, the Mishnah says, Kol ha-menachos yesh b'hem ma'aseh kli mibifnim. Right, we said that the kneading and the shaping was done inside the Azara. Sholuas Rebbe zo minayin. How do we know that the shaping and the kneading and the shaping of the mincha has to be performed in a kli shares inside the Azara? Amolahem harehu omer. It's based on a pasuk which is in Yechezkel Perek Mem Vav. Mem Hey Mem Vav. Those are the two chapters in Yechezkel that describe the future Beis Hamikdash. Vayomer Elai Zeh Makom Asher Yivashlu Shom HaKohanim Es HaOsham Ves HaChatos Asher Yofu Es HaMincha. Right, he adds the mincha here. Levilti Hotzi Es HaChotzer El HaChotzer HaChitzona. So now the pasuk equates the osham and the chatos with the mincha in one breath. Mincha dumya di osham v'chatos, ma osham v'chatos tu'unim kli, af mincha nami tu'una kli. And what kind of a kli are we talking about? We're talking about a kli sharis. The osham and the chatos require a kli sharis because it says in the pasuk asher yofu, asher yivashlu shama kohanim, and that could only be accomplished with a kli sharis, the cooking, etc. So these karbanos must be cooked inside the azara, as it says, levilti hotzias hachatzer chitzona, el hachatzer hachitzona. Now we have the analogy between the cooking of the asham and the chatas on the one hand, and the baking of a mincha. So a mincha must be baked in a kli shares inside the azara. Although the pasuk is not explicitly addressing kneading and shaping the mincha, but the analogy to asham and chatas is going to include these activities as well, just as in the case of the Osham Chatos, the activities that precede the cooking, meaning receiving and throwing the dam, must be performed in a kli shares in the Azor. So too in the case of the Mincha, the activities that precede the baking, namely kneading and shaping the dough, must be performed in a kli shares inside the Azor. So we would consecrate the mincha and a kli shares at the time of its kneading. Now the Mishnah says Hashulchan Arko Asara. So we had the overlap of the lechem aponim, and we had to bend them to a height of, again, according to Rabbi Meir, 2.5 tefachim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, then according to Rabbi Meir, 2 tefach. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, L'divrei Omer tefachayim va'umech. It's according to Rabbi Yehuda that the folding upwards of the lechem was 2.5 tefachim. Nimtza shulchan makadosh chameshes sar tefachim lemala. From the bottom of the shulchan till the top, all that space, all that, call it airspace, is 15 tefachim. The Gemara is going to attack this, but let's see. How do we get 15 tefachim? Right, because if we have 6 lechamim, and now we folded 2.5 tfachim. So how much is 2.5 times 6? Is that 15? Yeah? Good. L'divrei omer tfachayim, then 2 tfachim times 6 is 12. Is nimsa shel makadish 12 tfachim l'mal. Now, why do I need Rabbi Yochanan for this higher mathematics? What is the halachic nafkamina if the shulchan is makadesh all the lechamim up to a certain height? Then anything that goes into that shulchan, let's say, for example, he would take a kometz of a mincha and place it in that height, then the shulchan would be makadesh it, which means that it would become possible with lina. Let me just see if he adds anything here. Rabbi Yochanan's purpose is not to inform us, how tall the lechem upon him reach, according to Rabbi Yehuda Reb Meir, but rather if some other object, i.e., or e.g., I should say, kometz is placed on the shulchan within 15 tfachim, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it becomes sanctified. Within 12 tvachim, according to Rabbi Meir, it would be sanctified. Gemara says the following: Va'ika kanim. How can Rabbi Yochanan say that the shulchan only reached the height? Let's go according to Rabbi Yehuda, 15 tvachim. What about the kanim? Right, each one of the lechamim was stacked up on top of this rod, and the rod itself should add to the height. And the Gemara answers, Konim shikua mishakalahu. The konim were not laying on top of the lechamim, but rather were pressed down into the lechem. Sunk into the bread, he says, and no extra height was added to these stacks of lechamim. He says the kohanim would make indentations on the top of the lechem before they were baked. The kohanim would lie inside these indentations. Therefore, they didn't add any height to the stack of lechamim. And my timer, why would they do this? Why would they sink down the rods into the lechamim? Mishumi pushe lechem. The whole purpose here is to avoid the lechem becoming moldy, and somehow these konim are going to ensure freshness and allow air to flow between the loaves. But if you sink down the rods into the lechamim, there's no extra airspace. Sof kami apish lech. I don't get it, says the Gemara. The bread is going to become moldy. You don't gain anything by these rods that are sunken in. And the Gemara says the magbale purta, that somehow the rods, although they basically sunk down into the lechem, but part of the top of the rods, again, you're really splitting it with a sharp razor knife, would be above the lechamim. And therefore, that would allow the air to flow between the lechamim, between the lechem aponims. He makes the indentations in the dough shallow so that the rods are raised a bit above the top of the loaves. And that ensures a small amount of space between the loaves. Yeah, but now we're back to square one. So now, if the rods are above, then you're going to add to the length. So how do you get 15? And the answer is, it's such a small amount, it's less than a tefach, it's not calculated, right? Rabbi Yochanan is calculating tfachim. But wait a second, we put the shtei bazichin on top of the lechamim. That's going to raise the height, because the kiddush of the shulchan now has to include the levona on top. And the Gemara says, "Begavei de lechem aviyasve." Somehow they put the levona, which is in the bezichin, sunk down into the lechem. Ulabahade lechem avikaime. Right? Then obviously they don't add any height. In fact, the Gemara va'ika chronos. Well, you're only calculating the flat part of the lechem. What about the chronos? What about that part that you folded up? And the Gemara answers, chronos ligavei de lechem kayef lehu. Lechem alayu nochle. So again, he has a picture of this. I don't understand this picture at all. That's the honest truth. So I'm just going to fudge it, meaning I'm just going to give you a general feeling of what I think the Gemara is saying, that the chronos dipped under the lechem below it. How exactly you pull that off, I'm not sure. But in any event, the bottom line is they don't add any height. The horns did not project upward. This is important. Now maybe I'll chop it. They were folded into the hollow at the center of the loaf of the lower bread, the lower loaf. So the loaves had a hollow, which I think we learned yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so the chronos went into that hollow, so it doesn't add any height.